she was never supposed to exist. Somewhere in a manuscript about 3 women conducting an environmental survey in the North Pennines, a character nobody had planned simply walked into a funeral scene and refused to leave. That accident became one of the longest-running detective dramas in British television history, and behind the battered hat and the ancient Land Rover lies a story stranger, sadder, and more improbable than most of the murders she ever solved. It began in 1999, when the novelist Ann Cleeves was deep into writing what would become The Crow Trap. The book was meant to center on 3 women, not a police officer. But partway through, at a funeral, a large untidy woman shuffled onto the page uninvited, looking more like someone who'd wandered in off the street than a detective inspector. Cleeves has said many times that she had no notes on this character, no backstory prepared, no idea where she'd come from. Vera Stanhope arrived fully formed, took over the scene, and then quietly took over the rest of the author's career. She wasn't even supposed to be the point of the story, and she doesn't appear until well into the novel, which was never marketed as the start of a series at all. What makes The Accident stranger still is what Cleeves was consciously working against. Crime fiction at the time was full of glamorous, youthful female detectives, so she leaned hard into the opposite, a middle-aged woman, overweight, badly dressed, sharp as a blade underneath it all. Nobody in publishing was clamoring for that kind of heroine in 1999. It turned out to be exactly the reason readers, and later viewers, couldn't look away. For all the eventual success, Ann Cleeves herself spent decades in near obscurity. She published her debut crime novel back in 1986, then spent roughly 20 years as what the industry politely calls a midlist author, steadily published but barely promoted, with a small, loyal readership and no financial security to speak of. To make ends meet, she worked as a probation officer, in libraries, and in one of the more unlikely entries on any novelist's resume, as an assistant cook at a bird observatory on Fair Isle, one of the remotest inhabited islands in Britain. By her own admission, she wasn't much of a cook. She took the job anyway, and it changed her life twice over. It was there she met her future husband, a visiting ornithologist, and it was through him that she absorbed the bird-watching world that would later seep, quietly and specifically, into the Vera novels. Her breakthrough finally came in 2006, when Raven Black won the Duncan Laurie Dagger, at the time the richest prize in crime writing. After 20 years on the margins, she suddenly had a career people noticed. And there was one advantage nobody could have engineered. Cleeves had lived in the northeast of England for decades, so the pubs, the coastline, and the rhythms of how people actually talked to one another weren't research, they were home. That authenticity is a large part of why neither the books nor the series ever felt like an outsider's postcard of the region. Then came the casting that, in hindsight, feels inevitable but very nearly wasn't. Vera Stanhope is played by a 2-time Academy Award nominee, whose own beginnings were almost as unglamorous as her characters. Brenda Blethyn was born Brenda Ann Bottle in Ramsgate, Kent, in 1946, the youngest of 9 children in a working-class family, and she has spoken with real affection about that maiden name ever since. Bottle is hardly a name built for a marquee, but it was hers. Acting found her late. She spent years in ordinary office work, including a stint as a secretary for British Rail, before amateur dramatics led her toward formal training and eventually a place with the National Theatre. By the time Vera existed, Blethyn was already one of the most decorated actresses in Britain, having won Best Actress at Cannes and a Golden Globe for Secrets and Lies in 1996, with an Oscar nomination to match, followed by a second nomination for Little Voice in 1998. She was appointed OB in 2003. Most performers reach their widest audience in their 30s. Blethyn reached hers in her 70s, becoming a household name not through Hollywood, but through a woman in a battered hat solving murders on the Northumberland coast, and by every account she found the whole turn of events quietly amusing. She very nearly said no. Taking on a 2-hour drama series at 65, filmed for months every year hundreds of miles from home in some of the harshest weather British television production has to offer, was a daunting proposition for anyone, let alone an actress whose career could easily have wound down gracefully by then. What won her over, by her own account, was the writing itself, the character's intelligence, her loneliness, her sly humor, and her flat refusal to be pitted. It wasn't a token role for an older actress, it was the lead in every sense, a kind of part almost never offered to a woman over 60. The transformation was more deliberate than most viewers ever clocked. Blethyn wore padding to alter her shape, disappeared into a shapeless Mac, and let that one battered hat do the rest of the work, describing the whole costume as a kind of disguise so effective that once she stepped out of it, she could walk through Newcastle largely unrecognized, even while Vera was the biggest production filming in the city. The woman who built the show most viewers have never heard of. Producer Elaine Collins championed Cleeves' novels and saw television in a character the industry had mostly passed over, a heavy-set detective in late middle age with no love interest and no interest in acquiring one. Collins developed Vera for ITV in 2011, and 2 years later did it again, adapting Cleeves' Shetland novels for the BBC. And in one of those coincidences the industry still talks about, Collins is married to Peter Capaldi, who in 2013, while both her shows were airing, was announced as the 12th Doctor Who. For a few remarkable years, one household held the lead of the BBC's biggest institution alongside the producer behind two of the country's most watched detective dramas. Behind Vera's shoulder, the cast shifted more than fans sometimes remember. Detective Sergeant Joe Ashworth, played by David Leon, anchored the show's early years as the calm surface against which Vera's temperament could crash. When Leon departed in 2014 to work behind the camera, Kenny Doughty stepped in as DS Aidan Healy, bringing an entirely different energy, and stayed for 8 series, longer than any other partner Vera had. When Doughty announced his own departure in 2023, the production did something television almost never attempts: it went back. David Leon returned as Joe Ashworth for the 13th series, nearly a decade after he'd left, and the show ended exactly where it started, with viewers who remembered his very first case understanding precisely what that homecoming meant. Beneath the wit and the pet lies something far darker. Her father, Hector, was a criminal, not a murderer, but an illegal trader in rare birds' eggs, part of a genuinely ruthless underworld Cleeves knew about firsthand from her own years around birdwatching circles. In the novels, Hector raised Vera alone in the Northumberland hills after her mother died, dragging her along on illicit raids and teaching her to keep secrets from the authorities. The isolated cottage she calls home was never her choice. It was his, inherited along with everything unresolved that came with him. Cleeves has said Hector explains Vera entirely: the solitude, the wariness of intimacy, and the instinctive empathy for damaged people that makes her such a devastating interviewer of suspects. The landscape itself became a kind of co-star. Before Vera, the far northeast of England was one of the least photographed regions in British prestige drama, overshadowed by London, Oxford, and Yorkshire. The series filmed across Newcastle's quaysides, the vast Northumberland beaches, and those enormous indifferent skies, treating the terrain not as backdrop but as character. Cast and crew have described shooting in horizontal rain and freezing coastal winds that would shut down softer productions, with Blethyn standing on clifftops in that Mac take after take. Audiences abroad, especially in Australia, fell for the scenery as hard as the mysteries, and Vera Country became a genuine draw for travelers from Australia, Canada, and the United States, many of them standing on beaches they'd only ever known through a television screen. Readers who meet Vera on the page after knowing her from television are often startled by how much harder she is in print, pricklier and less patient, written without apology in the early novels. The warmth, the pet, the flashes of gentleness came from Blethyn's performance, not the source material, and Cleeves has openly credited that performance with reshaping how she writes the character now, saying she hears Blethyn's voice when drafting new Vera novels. In 2024, Blethyn made the decision herself that the 14th series would be the last, choosing to leave while she still loved the role and viewers still loved the show. The final episodes aired in January 2025 to millions of viewers, a farewell for a character who started in a book nobody expected to sell, and who simply stubbornly refused to leave.